Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us at today's Wednesday webinar. Today's topic is filing the 2022-23 FAFSA. I'm Mila Tappan from the Finance Authority of Maine, and with me today is Mary Dyer. And Mary is going to be watching the chat for us. So if you have any questions at all, please put them in the chat. I'll stop periodically, or Mary will interrupt me if need be, and we'll address those questions. If by chance we don't get them answered during the session, or if there are ones that need follow-up, I will include those in the email follow-up after this session. I hope to get that out to you by the end of this week. So this session has a lot of slides. We are not going to talk about every slide in detail, but I wanted to give you all of the various slides so you can use them as reference. I find even as I'm going through the year, I go back to this presentation and I'll check out the wording of a particular slide or something like that. So we are not going to talk about everyone in detail, but I did want to have all of them be there. We will focus on the slides where the most questions occur or where any changes have happened. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So today we're going to start by talking about the FSA ID first, and then we're going to talk about the FAFSA. Now, I debated about taking out the FSA ID slides. I had put them in last year because the look of the FSA ID application process or creation process was different. But again, I thought I'd leave them in because we get so many questions related to the FSA ID. Plus, I wanted you to be able to have those screenshots. So the FSA ID is the Federal Student Aid ID that every student needs in order to get through the federal financial aid process. So every student needs an FSA ID. Additionally, if the student is dependent, if parent information is required on the FAFSA, then one parent needs to have an FSA ID as well. The vast majority of you are professionals that work in the financial aid realm or in the access realm, so you're very familiar with the fact that the FSA IDs are tied to an individual's social security number. And why that is so important is because a person can only have one FSA ID. It's not like some of our other accounts where if we get frustrated and we can't remember the username or password, we can just create a new account. Because it's tied to the social security number, an individual can only have one FSA ID. So we really want people to be cautious when they're creating these. We want them to write information down and to keep track of it because they're going to need this FSA ID, not just now, but next year when they borrow loans, they're going to need it. They're going to need it all throughout the duration. So really important to have that information and to keep it in a safe place. In the perfect world, we like to have people get FSA IDs ahead of time. They certainly don't have to, but we think that is the best way to go if possible. So I'm just going to very quickly go through these slides so that you can visualize what a student sees or what a parent sees when they create an FSA ID. Again, they're going to go to they're going to go to studentaid.gov to create their FSA ID, and they're going to click on Create Account. Once they do that, they're going to log in. If they already had their FSA ID, they can do that. But otherwise, they're going to go ahead and click on Create an Account. It's going to tell them what this account is used for and what they need in order to create an account. And the key piece here is they need to have a mobile phone number and or an email address that they have access to. They have to have one of those two things. And I'll talk a little bit more about why that is so important. Additionally, this is one of these times they need to make sure the social security number is correct. We see issues when people think they know it and put it in and it's not correct. So great time to have individuals pull out their social security card if they're not 100% sure of their number. So the first part in the process is to provide personal information. This is even before creating the username and password. Very quickly, if for some reason someone's created an FSA ID, but they've forgotten that they created one, maybe it's a parent who has a couple of kids and they didn't realize this is what they had done several years ago, they're going to know it as soon as they enter their social security number, because again, it's going to say to them, you already have an FSA ID and you can only have one. They're going to create their username and password. They also will enter their email address here, but they only want to enter their email address if they have access to it, because they need to be able to verify that email address. and get a code from it. So if for some reason they can't access their email, they don't want to list their email here because they won't be able to get through this process unless they can navigate to their email address and receive an email with a verification code. Username is pretty straightforward. It will tell you whether or not it's already in use. And then you will create a password and confirm that, and it gives you the requirements here. Next is providing contact information. You will notice that they do mention the phone number, and so this is absolutely critical. People do have to put in their phone number or an email address. It's one or the other. We like it when people do both. They enter their email address and they enter their cell phone number, knowing that they have access to both of those things. The other piece that's critical about this is a cell phone number can only be used once, as can an email address. So let's just say that a student shares a cell phone with a family member who already has an FSA ID. If that phone number is already in use, they won't be able to use that phone number. Everyone needs to use their own social security number, have their own email address, and have their own phone number, which is a challenge, for some families. We want them to allow for phone recovery, because when people can't remember their FSA ID, it's really important that they are able to retrieve it and reset their password as easy as possible. It's going to ask them a little bit about communications. And then they're going to set up their challenge questions. There are 4 of them. So they want to set those up and make sure that their answers are correct. A minor tweak this year is that it automatically shows the answer now as they're typing it, which I think is a really good thing. We want to be sure that they're entering all of this information correctly and not inadvertently having a typo. They're going to confirm all of their information, edit it as needed, and then they're going to get the verification piece. And what happens here is when they provided their cell phone number and email address, it's in the system. But to finish off this process, they need to verify that they have access to those accounts. So they'll start by clicking on mobile phone number. And what's going to happen is they're going to get a text at that number with a 6-digit code. And they're going to enter that in here and then click continue. If they also provided their email address, they're going to click on that. They're going to have an email sent to their email account with a different 6-digit code, and they're going to enter that. Once they've done both of those things, both their cell phone number and their email address have been verified. That's the best case scenario, because that means they can use their email address or their cell phone number as their username or in place of their username. And if they ever forget their information and need to retrieve it or reset passwords, it's going to be so much easier. So we really, really recommend that both of those things be in place. If students or individuals need help creating an FSA ID, we do have a whole variety of short animated videos, one of which is create your federal student aid account. And another one, if you've already created one and are having issues, which is what the heck is wrong with my FSA ID? So that's more of a problem solving one. So we'd love to have you check out these videos, share them with others, and know that this video and a lot of others reside here on our website. All right, Mary, any questions before we continue?
Yes, just a quick question, Mila. If the phone number or the email address changes, can they update it later on?
Absolutely, and they should. And one of the things I should have mentioned is that when students are creating an FSA ID account, we don't want them to use their high school address. We prefer that they use a Gmail account or a Yahoo account or something that's going to live with them and go beyond their high school years. But if they, for some reason, do use their high school address, or if they get a different cell phone number, yes, they can absolutely go back to studentaid.gov, log in with their information, and then they can update it. And that's important that they do that.
And then, Mila, a couple of other questions. Is not verifying phone or email even an option to proceed?
Right. So if you put in an email address, Mary and I dealt with this the other night, you put in an email address and a phone number, you have to verify both of them in order to finish this process. So we had a mom the other night who was having trouble with her email. She just wasn't getting the verification code. So what we had to do is back up and take out the email address and proceed without an email address and only be able to verify the cell phone number in order to finish. So you have to be able to verify one or the other in order to create an FSA ID. But if you put in information for both, you've got to be able to verify both, which means getting that text or getting that email. So I hope that makes sense.
And then this question, is there a way to resolve an issue with a mobile phone number if a student tries to change theirs on the FSA ID website, but they receive an error about the phone number already being in use?
Yeah, so this is a problem for students. In particular, people are using track phones where the phone numbers have already been used. They may find that that phone number is already associated with an FSA ID. And at this point, they're not going to be able to use that phone number in order to create an FSA ID, or when they create the FSA ID, they won't be able to connect that phone number to them. And we do realize this is an issue for students, but they're going to have to use a different phone number or simply go with an email address.
Thank you, Mila. And then the last one, this person said, we submitted an FSA ID, but then it said we had to wait a day or so. What's next?
Yeah, so you actually can use your FSA ID immediately to go ahead and complete a FAFSA and to sign a FAFSA. What happens over the next day or two is it gets confirmed, it gets verified with the Social Security Administration. That step has to take place before you can do anything more. So you can get an FSA ID, you can use it immediately to do the initial FAFSA, but then let's say you want to go back in and you need to make a correction or add a school. You have to wait the 1 to 3 days, which it's going to take that long to process usually anyway, but you're going to have to wait the 1 to 3 days for it to be verified by the Social Security Administration before you can use that FSA ID again. You can use it immediately to submit the FAFSA initially, but then have to wait.
That's it, Mila. Thank you. We call Mila, just so you all know, the FSA ID whisperer at FAME. So if you have FSA ID questions in the future, she's definitely your gal. So that's all for now, Mila.
Okay, great. It's like being a detective. I think I should have been a detective in my other life. I like problem solving. All right, so let's move on with the FAFSA. So one of the things I want you to know about the FAFSA is that it has a new look and feel this year. So the questions are the same. They haven't made any significant changes to the questions, but it does look a little bit different. But thankfully, the home page looks pretty much the same, except they put some graphics in the background, okay? So when filing the FAFSA, the student is going to go to FAFSA.gov. Technically, the address looks different, but FAFSA.gov is what we talk about and where we want them to go. It's technically on the student aid website, but they can just type in FAFSA.gov and they'll be sure that they're at the right location. So here's where you're going to right off the bat start to see the differences. The first thing that individuals need to do when they come in to do a FAFSA is to identify themselves. Now, feds don't like this, but we ideally want everyone where possible to enter the FAFSA by indicating I am the student and want to access the FAFSA form. So whether it's the student, they're obviously going to go that route, or if a parent is doing it on behalf of the student, maybe the student's there, maybe they're not, we want the parent to enter this way as well, as long as they already have the student FSA ID, okay? So if a student FSA ID exists, we want everyone to enter saying, I am the student and I want to access the FAFSA form. It just works better, and I can go into more detail about that if need be. If a parent didn't have an FSA ID for the student yet, the student hadn't created one, and it wasn't possible to create one because the student isn't there and doesn't have access to their phone and their email, then they would enter as the parent. But that's the only time I would want that to be the case, because they won't be able to finish it. The preparer, don't worry about that. You guys, if you need help, you're going to come to us. We're not officially preparers. We just offer you free assistance. So once they've identified that I'm the student, I want to access the FAFSA form. If they already have their FSA ID, even if they just created it, they're going to click on login. If they get to this point and they didn't even realize that an FSA ID was a thing and that they had to create one, they would just click on create an FSA ID here first. And that would take them out to the site I just showed you. They could create their FSA ID and then they can use it immediately, come right back here to FAFSA.gov and continue on and file their FAFSA. Here is where they are going to enter their FSA ID. Let's say they have an FSA ID, but they can't remember what their username is, or they've forgotten their password, or they thought they know it and it's getting a message that it's not working. They could click on either of these. It's going to take them to the site we just looked at. It's going to give them the opportunity to retrieve a username or reset a password, and it's going to do it by sending them, for example, a text. And with that text, they're going to get a verification code that will allow them to retrieve their username or reset their passcode. That's why that initial process is so incredibly important, because as long as they have that, it's a piece of cake. So they're going to enter their FSA ID. Again, they could create an account if they got to here without realizing it. And then once they've entered their FSA ID, they're going to be on this page. So this is the Get Started page. And there are a couple of things I want to point out on this page. First, down here where it says FSA ID status as matched, if you have a student who created their FSA ID quite a while ago, more than 2 or 3 days ago, if they did it a week ago or 2 months ago, we want to be sure that the status is showing matched, not pending. Let's just say, and this happened last week, we have a student, they put in the wrong social security number. They did their FSA ID months ago. No one picked up on the fact that it was still showing as pending. If we'd realized it was pending at this point, we could have fixed the social security number, but no one realized it. And so they went ahead, they created their FAFSA, or they had their FAFSA processed with a wrong social security number. And now we have to start over. So if the student has created their FSA ID more than 2 or 3 days in advance, just make sure it shows as matched, because if it isn't matching after 2 or 3 days, that means there's an issue, okay? We want them to do a 22-23 FAFSA if they're applying for financial aid for next year. So high school seniors, that's the year that they're going to be completing the FAFSA for. It is the year that they will want to receive financial aid for. The 21-22 FAFSA does still exist. So if you have students who are currently in college who have not filed a FAFSA or who are planning to attend in the spring, it's a little late, but it's not too late to go through the financial aid application process. But most students that we're working with right now are doing the 22-23 FAFSA. The next thing they're going to do is they're going to create a save key. And this sometimes causes confusion because people are like, well, I just created a username and password. What's this save key? The save key is literally just a temporary password that you're going to create so that if for some reason you don't submit the FAFSA all in one sitting, then you can leave, it saves as it goes, you can leave the FAFSA, come back in, and once you put in the username and password, then enter in the save key, you're going to be able to pick up right where you left off. So that's one of the really nice things about the FAFSA is this save key allows you to pick up where you left off. Once the FAFSA has been submitted, the save key goes away. The only purpose of a save key is to enter it so that you can pick up where you left off in a partially completed FAFSA. So the first real screen you're going to see when completing the FAFSA is this one. A couple things I want you to pay attention to or to note is that this will show you all of the sections in the FAFSA. So you can see that there are 7 sections in the FAFSA. Now, when you're completing a FAFSA, you can't skip over sections. So I can't come into a FAFSA and immediately jump to parent demographics. I've got to complete the FAFSA in sequence. And the reason is because the FAFSA uses skip logic, which is great, and it makes it so much easier to complete the FAFSA, but it tells you what questions you need to answer depending on how you've answered the ones that you've completed so far. So you do need to go through those in sequence. Once you have gone beyond a section, you can then jump back to it. So you can come back anytime, but initially you need to go all the way through. You can't skip over uncompleted sections or incompleted sections first. You'll notice that the first section is all about the student. Think of the FAFSA as a student application because that's what it is. Even if parents are completing it for their students or the parents feel like they're the ones applying for financial aid, in reality, it is the student who's applying for financial aid, and the FAFSA is a student application. The whole first section is about the student, And much of it, if they entered their FAFSA with their FSA ID, is going to pre-fill with information from their FSA ID. If they have any questions as they're going through, each question has a little question mark. And if they click on that, it's going to provide them with more details as to what that question is looking for. It actually is really helpful if there is a question. And then last but not least on this screen, when moving through the FAFSA, we want to be sure that people use the continue button or the previous button, not their browser arrows. The browser arrows will cause an issue. It's a recoverable issue, but it just causes a hiccup in the system if they do that. So now I'm going to fly through a couple of slides because these slides, I just want you to have them for reference purposes. But one thing I want to note is that these are screenshots. I just mentioned that you can't jump over sections. Normally, if I'm here, I'm still going to be in student demographics. What this tells me is when whoever took this screenshot, this one wasn't mine, it was from the feds, they had already gone through and then they came back. So I didn't want that to throw you off. But here is going to be the student email and phone. Some of it will come over from the FSA ID. Next, they're going to have their student address. Again, that's going to come over from the FSA ID. They just need to make sure that it's correct. Then they're going to enter their state of residency. Obviously, if they're in Maine, it's going to ask them if they have lived in Maine for at least 5 years. Then they're going to see the question about US citizenship. And there's going to be a drop down here, and it's going to give them the option of saying that they're a US citizen, that they're an eligible non-citizen, or they're not an eligible citizen. This is one of the times when that question mark is a really good thing to check on if you're working with students who aren't US citizens and they're not sure whether they're eligible or not eligible. It is going to give them the details as to what defines an eligible non-citizen. If a student is an eligible non-citizen, when they say that, they are going to see a place for them to enter their alien registration number. The next screen that you are going to see is one about student education. A couple of things I want to mention related to this specifically is that it asks for the student's high school completion status, and it's going to ask whether the student has a high school diploma, or maybe it's a GED, or maybe they were homeschooled. All of those things are options. And Mary, I'll stop right after this slide. So all of those things are options. They're then going to enter the year that they will be working on, or what type of degree, excuse me, they'll be working on in the coming year. So it might be a first bachelor's, might be a first associate's, whatever is appropriate for their situation. It's going to ask them if they already have a bachelor's degree. It's going to ask them what grade level they'll be in school and whether or not they're interested in work study. I always want them to say yes to this. They can always reject work study later if they don't want it, but they want to say yes and be given the opportunity to receive it in case they're interested. Mary, what's up for questions?
Real quick, FSA ID and then a homeless student question. So this individual they created an FSA ID as a parent and then started the form, just a couple of screens. And they started as the parent rather than the student. Should they continue as a parent or should they start over as the student and have their child work on it?
Yeah, they have to start over. If they're applying for financial aid for their kiddo, they have to start over because their information being in the student section means that they, the parent, are applying for financial aid, which we do have some parents that are in need to. But if their goal is to apply for financial aid for their student, unfortunately, they have to go back and start over.
Thank you, Mila. And then the other question, what happens if students are homeless and do not have a mailing address?
I would have them, a lot of high schools will let them put in the high school address. I got to be perfectly honest, I have never had a scenario where I've seen federal student aid ever ever send anything via the actual mail. So I wouldn't get real hung up on the mailing address for this particular purpose. So just check whether the high school will let them do it or if they have a friend or relative that will let them put in their address instead. Okay, but I have never seen federal student aid send anything in the mail.
That's all for now, Mila. Thank you.
Okay, great. So here, the next question you're going to see is the selective service question. So right off the bat, what I want you to know about this question is that this question has to be answered, but it no longer has any impact on financial aid eligibility. So there was, in the COVID bill that passed in December, there were many changes to federal financial aid. most of which won't occur for a couple of years still. But one of which provided the opportunity to be implemented earlier, and it has been, which is that students registering with the Selective Service no longer has any impact on financial aid eligibility. In the past, males who were required to register with the Selective Service, if they didn't, they were ineligible for federal financial aid. That no longer is in place. So this question has to be answered, but even if the student is not registered and is supposed to be, it doesn't impact their financial aid eligibility. This change occurred over the summer or was implemented over the summer, and it simply was not able to come out of the FAFSA or off the FAFSA because it was too far along in development. So they do still have to go ahead and answer it, but it does not impact eligibility. But I did want to show you, if you do have a male, because the requirement that males register with the Selective Service still exists. So that requirement is still there. It just doesn't impact financial aid anymore. If you have a male who's 18, you could indicate that if they're not already registered with a Selective Service, you can select yes here, and they will automatically be registered with the Selective Service. So that makes it a little bit easier if you do have a student that needs to register. But again, they have to answer the question, but the question has no impact on financial aid eligibility any longer, and it will be coming off the FAFSA altogether. Students' driver's license number, they do not have to provide a driver's license number. Many students don't have one. So this question can be skipped if need be. This question is just going to ask if the student was ever in foster care. This question here doesn't impact eligibility. There is one down the road that does, but this one does not. What this question simply does is if the student says yes, they are provided with additional information by email about services that are available to foster youth. So it's for informational purposes. The next question has to do with the parent's highest level of completion. This is more for tracking first generation students and seeing basically who's first generation, who's not. We in Maine don't use these programs to award aid to first generation students, but some other states do. So you want to answer those based on the biological parent. So this is not the same as the parent in the financial section. This should be answered about the biological parents. This question is like the Selective Service question in that it is still on the FAFSA, but it no longer has any impact on eligibility. The rule had been that if a student had been convicted of certain criminal offenses related, we called it the drug question, while they were receiving federal financial aid, they became ineligible for federal financial aid unless they took certain actions. So this question has been removed in terms of having an impact on financial aid eligibility. It no longer does. But again, they couldn't get it off the FAFSA quick enough this year because it was so far into the process. So it is still there and it does have to be answered, but financial aid offices are ignoring it and it has no impact on financial aid eligibility. The next section that they are going to see is the high school section, but only students who indicate they have a high school diploma will see this. If they were homeschooled or have a GED, they won't even see this screen. Again, the magic of skip logic. Then they're going to confirm their high school after that. Next, they are going to list all of the colleges that they want to receive their FAFSA data. So they can list up to 10 schools here on the FAFSA. And so it's just going to be a matter of going through and adding one after the other. I think the easiest way to do it is to indicate what state the school is in, and then either city or school name, whichever you know best or have most confidence in. And so what it's going to look like is, for example, here I indicated the state of Maine, city of Bangor, and it showed me all of the schools that are in Bangor that participate in the federal financial aid programs. So then I would just click on one of those and I would continue to do that search as needed until I had listed all of the schools that I wanted to have on the FAFSA. One quick aside, the student, if they need to list more than 10 schools, has to submit their FAFSA, let it process, come back in, take off some schools and add some other schools. So if a student can realistically get their list down to 10 really great schools that they're interested in, that's the ideal, but there is a way around it if need be. Once they've listed their schools, or they can do it as they're listing their schools, they need to provide housing plans. So they need to answer the question whether they're planning to be on campus, off campus, or with parents. So at this point in time, have them take their best guess. If they're indecisive, I recommend that they put on campus and then follow up with the school if that changes. Next, students are in the dependency section because this is actually in where they really are. This is now reflective of what it would show if they were going through this process. So this is one of the first questions that determines dependency status. So a student is considered to be independent and not needing parent information if they meet certain criteria. We've actually already addressed a couple. One is, are they 24? Another is, are they a graduate student? If they were those two things, they would automatically be considered independent. Another one is marital status. If the student is currently married, then the student would automatically be considered independent. Most of our students who are high school seniors or more quote unquote traditional age students are probably not yet married. Again, we're in the student section. So if they're not able to say yes to the marriage question, then they're going to see some additional questions. And all of these questions are determining their dependency status. So once they can answer yes to any one of the dependency questions, that's when parent information is no longer going to be required. So if we have a student who's not 24, not in graduate school, and they're not married, they will then see the questions about dependent children. So if they have children, or they will have children who will receive more than half of their support between July of 22 and June of 23, that during that award year, then they would indicate either yes or no. If they indicate no, they're going to continue to see questions. If they say yes, that's going to automatically make them independent. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind. When students are determining whether or not children receive more than half of their support from that student, you want to look at who is providing the housing and the food and the clothing and all of that for that child. They can include any support that they receive from the state or federal government as the student providing that support. But if we have a student who has a child, the student is still living at home with her parents maybe, and the parents are providing the roof over their heads, the food and all of that, they're probably not able to say yes because they're not providing more than 50% of the support. On the other hand, if that student is a full-time student, they're maybe getting some financial aid, they're getting maybe TANF, they're getting housing assistance, they're living with their child, then they, yes, indeed, are providing more than half of that child's support typically. The other thing is if a student is pregnant, they can answer yes to this question, assuming that they're going to have the baby, which it would be the case during that next award year. The second part of this is other dependents. So this would be other than children. So a scenario where you might have other dependents where you would say yes is, I had a student one time who was like 21 and the student's mother lived with her and mom was on Social Security. So mom did have some income, but in reality, the student, not only did she go to school full-time, she worked full-time and she provided more than half of the support for her mother. So she was able to answer yes to this question. Another time we sometimes see it is we have students who are supporting their younger sibling. So again, a 22-year-old who maybe is providing more than half of the support for a younger sibling, they might be able to answer yes to this question. Mary, I'm going to go just a little bit further and then I'll take another break. If all of those the student can't answer yes to, then they are going to see these questions, again, for the purpose of determining whether or not the student is independent or dependent. If the student can answer yes to any of these questions, they are going to be considered independent. So are they on active duty? Are they a veteran? At any time since they turned 13, are their parents deceased, or were they in foster care, or were they a ward of the court? Were they an emancipated minor? Or does someone other than their biological parents or step-parent have legal guardianship of them? If they can answer yes to any of those, then they are going to be considered independent. Last but not least, if they still can't answer yes to any of those, they will see this last question. And this last question is the homeless question. On or after July 1 of 2020, so we're talking about, this is the correct date. So if from that point forward, you were self-supporting or at risk of being homeless, if you said yes, then you would be considered independent. Otherwise, no, you are going to see that the student is considered dependent and needs to provide parent information on the FAFSA. Before I take a question, Mary, the last thing I just want to say about the homelessness, if the student says, yes, they're homeless, we're going to deal with that in just a moment. Or if the student is unable to provide parent support, even though they're required to, we're going to address that in a moment. So are there other questions before we continue on to the parent section?
Just one question, Mila, and the question is, we have a student who is 17. He was homeless, but he received help and now has a house that he lives in with other boys. He's an unaccompanied minor. How should he fill out his FAFSA?
He should indicate that he's homeless. And we're going to talk about that in just a second. And so I'll talk about what the next steps will be for that student.
Great, thank you. That's all for now.
Okay, great. All right, so, and I know I'm talking quickly because I'm trying to get through a lot. Again, we're recording this. So if you ever want to go back and just listen to a particular section, you can do that. And you certainly can always follow up with me directly with questions. But we're going to go ahead and we're going to continue as if the student is a dependent student who's able to provide parent information on the FAFSA. Now, one of the things that's new this year is this slide. This slide did not exist previously. And this slide is just informational. So what this slide allows a student to do is to figure out kind of what their status is. So if their parents live together, whether they're married or unmarried, the student could click on this little caret and it's going to tell them who has to provide information. In that case, it's going to be both their parents, you know, both mom and dad or mom and mom or dad and dad, depending on the scenario, if they're married or unmarried and live in the same household. However, we have a lot of students out there where the parents are divorced or separated and they live with one parent more than the other. So when you click on the caret here, what the student would see is that you need to provide information about the parent that you lived with most during the last 12 months. So that's the parent for whom they would provide information. And then additionally, if that parent is remarried, then you provide information about the step parent as well. So again, this is just an informational screen that helps them know who they need to provide information for. They then come to this screen where they are going to enter their parent's marital status. So they've identified who their parent is for the purposes of filling out this FAFSA, and then they need to list the current marital status of that parent as of today. So just to be clear, if biological parents were divorced and they live with mom more than dad, they're going to provide mom's information on the FAFSA. So when mom answers this question here, she needs to answer what her current marital status is as of today. And if mom has gotten remarried, she needs to say that she's married or remarried, and her spouse's information is going to be required on the FAFSA. They'll then go ahead and indicate when they got married or remarried. So these screens I'm going to go through pretty quickly. This is just all the demographic information about the first parent, and then it's going to be all the demographic information about the other parent. Next, parents are going to provide their state of legal residence and indicate whether or not they have lived there, you know, depending on how many years. The question will give them the correct number of years they're asking about. And then they're going to come to the household size question. So what this question is getting at is how many people are in that household, and then it's going to ask how many of them are in college. So when you're doing this, keep in mind that it doesn't want you to include the student, and it's not asking you about the parents. It's automatically, it already knows that there's a student, and it automatically knows that there is either one or two parents based on the answers to the questions of the previous screen. It's already calculating that. What they want to know is about anybody additional. So this is where they would add in any additional children, and it talks about what the criteria is to meet that, or any other dependents. Again, very similar to what we talked about in the dependency status section, but applying it to the parents. It's then going to carry that over. So what it did here is it brought over the student, it brought over two parents, because in this scenario, I indicated they were married, and then it brought over the fact that there was another sibling. So there's four in this family's household, and then it asks, out of those two dependents, how many will be in college? And for the moment, it's only the one student that is in college. So they keep tweaking the screen and this section, trying to make it flow a little bit better and a little bit easier. So it really, I think, works pretty well, but it is key to make sure that they know that students and parents are already included before they even get to that point. Now we're in the tax filing section. So now we're in the parent financial section. And what it's going to do is start asking it's asking for information about income. Now for the 22-23 FAFSA that we're doing, it's 2020 income information that's required. So what I want you to do is you would go here and you would click on this, and it would give you a variety of options to provide your tax filing status. So for many parents, it's going to be already completed because they've done their 2020 tax return. But in other cases, some people don't have to file a tax return. We have parents out there because maybe they get disability or something like that. They don't have to file a tax return, and that's fine. They just indicate that they're not going to file a tax return. We've still got a few people out there that need to file but haven't. They can also indicate that they plan to but haven't, okay? Assuming that the family has already completed the taxes, they're going to indicate what type of tax return they filed. It's typically almost always an IRS 1040. The EZ and the A have been gone for a couple of years, so it's almost always a 1040. And then they're going to list their tax filing status. Again, we have a married couple, they're filing a married joint return. So based on all of that, it looks like they're eligible to use the IRS data retrieval tool. And we want them to do that. So please have them use that IRS data retrieval tool. A quick scenario as to when they wouldn't be able to use that. Let's say that parents got divorced. And so we've got only mom's information, but mom and dad were divorced recently enough that for 2020, they had a joint tax return. They wouldn't be able to use the IRS data retrieval. They'd only need to provide mom's information and they'd have to enter that manually. Another thing, in the past, if you filed an amended tax return, the IRS data retrieval tool did not work, but it does now. It does work even with amended tax returns. So we want them to use that tool. Faster and easier, lots of good benefits of doing that. And so what they're going to see is the parents will log in to the IRS data retrieval tool. And guess what they use to do it? They use their FSA ID. So this is the first time that parents would need to enter their FSA ID. If they already have one, great, they'll just go ahead and put in the information. If they don't already have one, they will click on create an FSA ID and they will go to the studentaid.gov site. They will create their FSA ID and then they can come back and they can use it immediately. If they have an FSA ID, because maybe they have an older child, but they can't remember it, they can click on forgot username or forgot password, and they can go to the FSA ID site and retrieve that information. So lots of things they can do on this screen. They want to pay attention again to whether they're parent 1 or parent 2 and put in the correct FSA ID that associates with that parent. If they say parent 1, but provide an FSA ID for parent 2, it's not going to work. So if the FSA ID isn't working, one thing to double check is that those things are consistent. Then they'll click on continue. They'll get this very scary message, but they just need to say okay. And then they're going to enter information from their tax return. Some of the information is going to pull over automatically from the FAFSA, so the name, parent social, stuff like that. But when they get to this screen, their address will not be listed here. They need to put in their address exactly as it is on their tax return, because it's using that to match and to find the tax return. If there's anything different, even if it's a mistake, we saw one of our coworkers, they spelt her street wrong. She had to enter her street incorrectly as it was on her tax return in order for it to retrieve her tax information. So super important to have the tax return in front of you when entering this information here. But assuming that it gets entered correctly, then it's going to retrieve the information. It's going to show you all the information it's going to pull over. It's going to pull all of this over, even if there were zeros. You would then click on this little box here, which lightens this one up. And then within a click of a button, you're back in the FAFSA. You're back in the FAFSA, and it will show you that information has been transferred from the IRS. It's not going to actually show it. That is masked, but it's there. If people filed a joint tax return, they are still going to need to put in income from work for both parents. If you think about a joint tax return, on line 1, it asks for your wages, but it combines them. So my husband and I's tax return, both of our wages are put together. That works for tax purposes, but for financial aid purposes, parent one income needs to be separated out for parent two. So even when they use the IRS data retrieval tool, they're going to need to put in this information, but it tells them where they're going to find it. Oftentimes it's going to be on the W-2. Pulls over tax information. Then it's going to ask them a bunch of questions or several questions, some of which will come over from the tax return. I'm not going to go through these ones individually. A lot of them will pre-fill. A couple more questions it's going to ask, like, do you pay child support out? So for example, if a family pays out child support, they put that here, and then the formula knows that that money is not available to help pay for college. So that's the purpose of the questions on this screen. And then they'll see a question about untaxed income. This one, I just read through the questions and see if they're applicable. The one that is most commonly applicable is this one here, payments to a tax-deferred pension or retirement plan. If people are contributing to a tax plan, to a retirement plan, they're often doing it pre-tax, so it doesn't show up on their tax return. But for financial aid purposes, they need to list the amount that's being contributed for that 1 year, 2020 in this case. Where that will show up is on the W-2. So they want to be sure that they have their W-2s in front of them as well as their tax return. And if they do contribute pre-tax, that they list that information there. Last but not least, in the parent section, they are then going to deal with the asset question. It's going to ask them if their assets exceed a certain amount. This amount is going to be different depending on the parent age and marital status. When they are calculating whether or not their assets exceed that amount, I want them to know that there are certain assets they exclude. They're going to exclude their primary residence. That is not an asset for the purposes of the FAFSA that has to be listed. They're going to exclude the value of the retirement plan. We did have to have them list their income that they contributed to a retirement plan, but the value of their retirement plan that's sitting over there waiting for them to retire, that is excluded from the FAFSA. Additionally, if they own a small family-owned business with fewer than 100 full-time employees, that's excluded from the FAFSA. So for many families, they may find that they don't have assets that exceed this dollar amount. The things that would count: cash, savings, checking. 529 plans would count as a parent asset, second properties, non-retirement investments, things like that. If they don't exceed this amount, they say no, and they go on to the next screen. If they say yes, then they see this, and then they have to enter the assets for those particular three categories. Mary, I'm going to go on and do one more piece, and then I'll stop again. Now, I just showed you what families see when they earn over $50,000 per year. But one of the things that makes the FAFSA easier to complete than ever before is the fact that there's a simplified pathway. So for families who earn less than $50,000 a year, way back after their income, but before all of the screens that we just looked at, they would have been asked these questions. It would have asked them a question about Schedule 1, and I'm not going to go into detail here, but it's basically, did you file Schedule 1? And even if you did you do it for these reasons? So read that question carefully. They ask if a parent is a dislocated worker. And then they also ask if the family, anyone in the family, receives any of these federally means-tested benefits and did in either 2020 or 2021. So basically, there are three criteria for determining whether or not people can go down this simplified pathway. Either they didn't have to file a Schedule 1, or they only did for the identified reasons, or they're a dislocated worker, or they have benefits, they receive benefits in any of these programs, okay? So if they get main care, which is Medicaid, if they get SNAP, if they get any of these, they meet this simplified pathway criteria. Now, very quickly, because I typically get this question, what about if they get free and reduced lunch, but it's because everyone in that school gets free and reduced lunch? They can go ahead and they can say yes to that because there's no way to differentiate otherwise. But if they have one of the other benefits, be sure that they list those. The question about free and reduced lunch is coming off in a couple of years for that exact reason. So If they can answer yes, either to the Schedule 1 question, to the dislocated worker question, or they receive one of these benefits, then what they are going to see is if they make between $27,000 and $50,000 a year, it's going to ask them if they want to skip the assets. So yes, this is one of the simplified pathways for families that earn under 50,000 but more than 27. They typically, if they participate, they can answer yes to any of those questions. They don't have to provide any assets on the FAFSA, which is why we talk about the benefit of saving, because many families don't even have to list assets on their FAFSA. If their income is even lower, if their income is below 27,000 and they met any one of those 3 criteria, look at what they're going to see. And this was back several screens. They would have seen this. Do you want to skip the remaining questions about your and your mother? Because in this case, I had just a single parent, income and assets. So after the income questions, before all of the other 3 slides that asked for a lot of income, before all of the assets, if they met that criteria, would see this screen. This will allow them to skip all of the remaining parent income questions. It will allow them to skip all of the parent asset questions, and it will allow them to skip all of the student financial questions, all of them. You won't even see, it will skip right over section 6 here. So the student financial information section is virtually the same as the parent section in terms of the questions that are asked. But again, there are times when you will not even see that section, because for those families that are eligible for that simplified pathway and earn under $27,000 a year, they're going to be able to skip those questions. We want them to skip those questions, and those students are automatically going to have a 0 EFC. So then the FAFSA is going to provide you with a summary of some questions. I didn't list all of them, but then you will click continue, and the student will see this is arranged a little bit differently in the past. The student's going to see all of these acknowledgements. They're going to click and acknowledge them, and they're going to sign the FAFSA. So then they're going to be here. I didn't skip any screens. They're going to be here showing a signed FAFSA, and then the parent is going to need to sign. You determine whether it's going to be parent 1 or parent 2. It doesn't matter which parent in terms of, it doesn't matter who was first on a tax return. That is totally irrelevant. Parent 1 and 2 can be either way. They can go ahead and they can sign the FAFSA. If they haven't created an FSA ID yet, they could create one here, or retrieve their username or password here as well. But assuming that they've got their FSA ID, they would enter it, and then they would submit the FAFSA. Right here, they'd sign it and they'd submit it. There are other ways to sign a FAFSA. I don't love these, but I want to mention them. They can print off a signature page. I would only have them do it if parents cannot get an FSA ID. So for example, with some of our new Mainers, the students have a social security number, but the parents don't. If you don't have a social security number, you can't get an FSA ID. So they'd have to print off a signature page. Or you can submit the FAFSA without signing, but that's not a good idea. So please get the FSA ID if at all possible and sign it while you're initially submitting your FAFSA. They then get a congratulations screen. This year, we seem to most of the time be missing the opportunity to transfer parent information to another student's FAFSA, unfortunately. This screen also would list EFCs and some additional information. But it lets them know when we see this, we're ready to throw a party, hallelujah, the FAFSA has been submitted. When they go back into the FAFSA after it has been processed, it's going to tell you what the current status is. So successfully processed, but this is a new screen. This looks different than last year. And you're going to notice that they have 3 options. They can view their student aid report, and it's really cool how they can do it now. They can do it section by section, and it's really, really neat. You can check it out if you have a student that you're working with. Or they can make corrections to a FAFSA. You don't ever update a FAFSA, but if you make a mistake, you want to fix it. Or you can update school information. So if a student wanted to add a school that they hadn't listed initially, or they want to take a school off because they're already at 10 and add more, they would click on update schools, and that they would go back into the FAFSA with their FSA ID. They'd create a new save key, they'd add that school and then submit it. All right, I'm going to take a deep breath for a second. Mary, see if we have any questions before we finish off the last two little pieces.
Just one question, Mila. And it was back in the dependency section. What if the second parent is uncooperative and won't give their information, the SSN? And I think it was in the parent section in the case of a remarried, but the answer is really the same regardless. If you would encounter a parent or a student whose parents will just refuse to give the information, what advice do you have?
We're going to talk about it. Okay.
Okay.
That will hit that.
Okay.
So last two things, homelessness and special circumstances. So if a student is homeless and they indicate that they were homeless and self-supporting, or they were homeless or were self-supporting and at risk of being homeless, they'd indicate yes. For students who can easily document it through one of these three scenarios, this process is really pretty straightforward. So for our high school seniors, if their school lists them as homeless, then they just indicate this, that their high school has them documented as being homeless. If they are in a shelter or a youth center, if the director of those programs can provide them with documentation, if they've determined that this student meets that criteria, then the student just says, okay, my high school says I'm homeless. They've determined I'm homeless. I say, yes, I continue. They can go ahead. They're considered to be independent and they can submit their FAFSA with no parent information. Now it's going to still ask them, do you want to answer questions about your parent? No, they do not. Okay. They don't need to. Only in some cases where they're pursuing like a doctoral degree, would that be necessary? So all the students we're working with, no, they don't want to provide that information. But what if they can't answer yes to one of these three? And this might even be a college student who is, been out of high school for a bit. So their high school can't document it. They don't live in a shelter. They live on campus, but they are at risk of being homeless because the only place they have to live is their dorm. And they don't have another place to go. I mean, a lot of schools have actually started doing break housing because there are students in this scenario. Then that student will have to indicate that, yes, I'm an unaccompanied youth who is homeless or at risk of being homeless, but I can't get any of these three organizations to document that. In that scenario, they will see this. They will be reminded of the definition of what homeless and unaccompanied is. Just want a quick caveat here. If a student was living in a homeless shelter with their parents, they are not unaccompanied. They would not meet this criteria, okay? Because they are living with their parents and their parents would still be required to file the FAFSA. But if a student is homeless and unaccompanied, then they would click continue and they can submit their FAFSA. They do get a warning that there's no parent information and no EFC would be calculated. And most importantly, that student has to follow up with the financial aid office. So they have to follow up with the financial aid office so that the financial aid office can make a determination of whether or not that student is homeless or at risk of being homeless. So they'll say, okay, I'm going to go for it because that's my scenario. They will submit their FAFSA, but the very key piece is they have got to follow up with the financial aid office. Kind of similar is if you've got a student who has special circumstances. So let's just say we've got a student who can't provide parent information on the FAFSA. So it says they need to, but they can't. And that's either because they don't know where their parents are, their parents refuse to provide information, they've got an abusive situation. It might be any number of things, but they just can't provide parent information. They're going to click, I cannot provide parent information. And then they are basically going to go down one of two pathways. They're going to also be told that an EFC is not going to be calculated and they're going to have to follow up with the schools as well. But the two pathways are this. There are students who have special circumstances. For example, they are in an abusive situation and they left home. Their parents are incarcerated. I one time had a student whose his father was incarcerated because he killed his mother. I mean, talk about a horrible situation. Obviously, that student couldn't provide parent information. The parent, can't be found or any of those things. Those are special circumstances. Those are cases where the financial aid office wants to talk with the student more and potentially get their circumstances documented, and they can do what's called a dependency override. They can consider the student to be independent and not needing to provide parent information. But here's the thing. A lot of what people think should qualify them to be able to be independent doesn't do that. So a student is not independent just because they don't live with their parents. They're not independent just because their parents don't support them. They're not independent just because their parents won't help them. They're not independent just because their parents don't claim them on a tax return. Those two things are completely disconnected. And they're not independent if their parents refuse to put information on the FAFSA, okay? So back to the scenario Mary just mentioned, none of those things qualify as special circumstances. So we need students to know what qualifies and what doesn't. None of these things do. But if they were in an abusive situation, that potentially would. At the bottom of this screen, you're going to see there's this unsubsidized loan option. I just moved it to the other screen. So here is where, and this is a little bit different than last year, you guys. Here's where the student is going to say, okay, I've reviewed the information, and I'm frozen. I've reviewed the information, and here's where things stand. Based on what you said, yeah, I guess I can provide parent information. Secondly, I have special circumstances. You know, it's abusive. I left my home. My parent has mental health issues or that issue or is incarcerated. I can't provide parent information and I have special circumstances. Or number three, I don't meet those special circumstances criteria, but my parent or step parent or whoever just won't provide any information for the FAFSA. If they won't, the student can still submit a FAFSA, but all they're going to be eligible for is an unsubsidized student loan. And they have to follow up with the financial aid office. So in all of these circumstances, the student has got to follow up with the financial aid office, and the financial aid office can have a conversation with them and determine the next course. But if the student doesn't follow up, everything's just in limbo. So that's the key piece that we want you to know. If the student cannot provide parent information, indicate that they've got special circumstances or not, but follow up with the financial aid office. Wow. We have FAFSA help sessions. You can go to fafsa.famaine.com/events if you want to join us at one of our sessions. I know we are at 2 o'clock. I'm happy to stay as long as you need me to, and to answer any questions that we have, Mary, that have been asked or still people would like to ask questions. We will continue to record this. So if you need to cut out right now, know that the recording will be available. And if you wanted to come back and listen to any of it or just pick up and listen to the end part about the questions, you can certainly do that. So, Mary.
Not a ton of questions at the moment, but there was a question about whether or not the IRS backlog of processed returns, will that affect the IRS data retrieval and that it won't pull over the information? I don't know. I've not seen that this year in our sessions, but I'm wondering if you've experienced that at all or reading about that being an issue.
No, actually, you know, I hesitate to say it out loud. That is not where we've been having issues this year. The IRS data retrieval has actually been working well. And again, I was one of those people. We did an amended tax return and it worked. I was not convinced it was going to, but it's working for amended returns, and we are seeing them get processed, or the IRS data retrieval tool being available. Now, obviously, if taxes haven't been processed at all, then the IRS data retrieval tool is not going to work. In those cases, what we want families to do is, if their taxes have been done, so they know what the numbers are, we want them to manually enter those numbers. If their taxes have not been done at all, then ideally we want them to manually enter that information using the best information that they have. But if they're a week or two from getting their taxes done, they probably want to hold tight until they get their taxes done so that the information can be as accurate as possible. We never want people to miss a deadline though, and we do want them to get this done early. If a family doesn't use the IRS data retrieval initially because they've just done their taxes and they haven't been processed, they can go back in later and they can use the IRS data retrieval tool at a later point in time. And they can do that, like if the school needed them to verify their tax information, they could do that even after the fact.
Great. And then the last question, Mila, was about, I believe it was the asset protection. The question was, what is the earnings range in order for a parent to skip section 7? And I did explain there are a number of different variables and factors that go into that, but so you may not be able to give a range. But I think well, it was saying to skip section 7. So that, I believe that was in regards to asset reporting, but perhaps not.
Okay, because section 7 is the sign and submit section. But I'm going to answer it in the sense that if a family makes less than 50,000, that's when they can go down that simplified pathway. And if they can answer yes to any one of the 3 criteria, no Schedule 1 or only under certain circumstances, dislocated worker, or receive federally means tested benefits, you know, that's when they're not going to have to provide any student or parent asset information. So I'm not sure if the person who asked that question, if I haven't answered it, feel free to put it in the chat and I'll give it another shot.
Thank you, Mila. And then another question just came up about the FSA ID and creating the accounts. And it was, I'm running into issues where students create their accounts, but no longer have access to the email or the phone that they provided. They didn't set up a challenge question, or they can't answer whatever they indicated. Do they need to contact FAFSA to do a complete reset since their social security number has already been registered?
Yes, theoretically they do. Now these are the ones why Mary jokes, you know, that I am a detective sometimes. And there are sometimes ways that we can retrieve them if they have access to something, right? Either their phone or their email, or their challenge questions. You know, we are happy to work with students and parents to try to help them retrieve that. But if all else fails, they don't have access to that cell phone, they don't have access to that email, that's why they need to keep these things up to date, they can't answer the challenge questions, then yes, they ultimately do need to call federal student aid. What federal student aid will do is basically ask them all the things that we will have already have asked them. And then it will provide them with a link, and they will get a link or an email address, excuse me, where they will provide documentation to who they are. So they'll provide a copy of their license or something like that to verify their identity. Then they'll get a link from federal student aid that will allow them to reset their password and create a new username. And that does take a little bit. So that's kind of like the last resort, but it does work. It does work. It just takes a little bit of time.
Great. And then the last thing, Mila, and this is sort of my own question that I think just for you to comment on, but it came up a little bit in the chat. There was an individual who was completing it, or attempting to sign the FAFSA, and they were getting an error. And they were able to solve it by clearing their cache. And so just maybe talk a little bit about some of the glitchy stuff that we've had this year, trying new browsers, some of those techniques, maybe that untaxed income section that can be troublesome at times. Just little tips for ways to resolve that.
Yeah. So we are seeing some glitchy things this year. Last year was nice and smooth, and they redid, you know, the look and the feel of the FAFSA, and it does seem to have resulted in some issues. Sometimes the issues are as simple as, and this is like turning off our computer and rebooting, right? It's very frustrating, but sometimes it is as simple as getting out and getting back in. That sometimes can fix it. The other way, and sometimes you can resolve an issue, is what Mary mentioned. Try a different browser. I literally on my computer have Chrome, Firefox, Edge. I have all of them because we've had times when one's worked and another one hasn't worked. Try it on a phone. So if you have a phone and you want to just, you know, try to finish it up on the phone, terrible for the eyes, but give that a shot and see if that works. Make sure if you do use a different browser, or a new browser, make sure you're clearing your cache. All of those things are kind of the standard ways to get around this issue. We are unfortunately seeing some cases that have not been resolved yet. So we've got a couple of families that we know of who can't get beyond, in one family's case, they can't get beyond the student section. So they're at the end of the student financial section and they just keep clicking next and it's sending them back in a circle. It's just not letting them submit. And there's a few other glitchy things like that. If you are seeing those glitches, two things. One is reach out to us. We'd like to have you reach out to us, not so much that we can fix these. We'll try our darndest and we'll try all the tricks we're learning as we go. But ultimately, we want to know about those problems because we do report those. So we communicate with federal student aid tech, and we send in an email to say we're seeing these issues, and they investigate them. So we want to know if you're running into that. Now, like anytime you work with a computer programmer, it really helps to know, was there an error message? Where were you in the process? What were you trying to do when it created the issue? You know, what have you already tried? That's really helpful to know that. And then ultimately, probably what we're going to have you do, and we hate doing this, but it's to call federal student aid and see if they can resolve it with you. At a minimum, it lets them know that they've got an issue that needs to be fixed, and hopefully there is a way to resolve it. So, you know, we're 2 weeks in, still seeing some challenges, but really trying to figure out how to navigate. So please reach out to us.
I think that's all for now, Mila. Thank you. That was really helpful to have those last tips.
Okay, great. Well, I can talk with the best of them, and I can talk faster than many. So I know I went super fast. I appreciate all of your time. Again, if you want to re-listen, you can do that, but you can always just reach out to me directly as well. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you all have a great day. You know, the screenshots at a minimum can be a resource going forward. But please have students and come to our events. And we look forward to hearing from you, and let us know how we can be of assistance.